The electoral integrity bill is a bit of a con, and putting the word integrity in the title of a bill cannot disguise that. It seeks to solve a problem which in reality doesn't exist, as we've heard. With only one person convicted of voter fraud and one person cautioned, it's very hard not to draw the conclusion that something else is going on here. And if the government disagrees with this, and I appreciate that it does, then what the government needs to do is let us see evidence of why it is so convinced that this legislation is necessary. Now, the Honourable Member for Bolsover told us that he was aware that alleged election fraud had taken place to his knowledge, but by his own admission, this attempt was thwarted. So that was before we had this legislation in place. So clearly this legislation wasn't necessary to prevent that. But what we do have evidence for, I won't give way because we need to move on. What we do have evidence for from around the world where voter ID operates is that it creates a barrier, what we've heard about, a barrier to voting, a barrier between citizens and their right to exercise their democratic choice. Now, the Honourable Member opposite said we don't know if election fraud is taking place, but all we can rely on are the facts, and the facts don't bear out the need for this bill. And here's the rub. All the evidence shows that the more socially disadvantaged a voter is, the more likely that voter ID, that voter will be further disadvantaged by the introduction of voter ID. Is this a mere accident, Mr Chair? Is it a mere accident that these the demographic most likely to be disadvantaged by this bill are less likely to vote Tory? It must be an accident, surely. It must be an accident because the title of the bill is called the Electoral Integrity Bill. So I'm sure that any advantage or perceived advantage to the Tory party will be accidental. What the American experience tells us is that voter ID resulted in reduced turnout among black, Hispanic and working class voters. But of course, the government will know that. Research in the UK shows that voters least likely to possess the necessary ID include the most disadvantaged groups in our community. But again, the government will know that. The government well knows that 3.5 million voters across the UK don't have access to photographic identification, and 11 million don't have a driving licence or a passport. The example, even in Northern Ireland, shows that an estimated 25,000 voters did not vote because they did not have the required form of identification. But this information is not routinely published, and no proper work has been done to analyse the further effects in Northern Ireland. And the government is willing to spend the estimated £10 million in implementing this exclusive, unnecessary scheme at a time when the government will surely agree that spending is under real pressure. So it's almost impossible not to be suspicious of this measure. In contrast, what do we see in Scotland? We see in Scotland the franchise extended to 16 and 17-year-olds for the Scottish Parliament and local authority elections, and also votes for foreign nationals as well who have leave to remain. And perhaps it's worth considering, as a direct result of that, in May's Scottish Parliament election, we saw the highest voter turnout for any election since devolution was established in 1999. So there might be a lesson for that in proponents of this particular legislation. Surely any healthy democracy would seek to encourage voter participation instead of doing what we know suppresses turnout for reasons which simply are not backed up by any convincing and sustained evidence. The so-called Electoral Integrity Bill is very, very much about elections, but let's be clear, it has nothing to do with integrity, which many argue is not really a priority for this government anyway. But sadly, this is a problem for this government because the voters are watching and they understand what's going on here. And the views expressed by those of us today who oppose this bill are speaking for the electorate who know.